Thank you, Stephen. We continue with our Remembrance Day theme. Canada was caught flat-footed at the outbreak of the Second World War. We had almost no equipment or soldiers. Eventually, we geared up for war, and our soldiers fought heroically. But
historian Jack Ranestein found few heroes among our generals. He also predicts that if we follow our present course of defense policy, we are destined to repeat our history of lack of readiness. Rick Grant and Jack Ranestein met and talked about his book, The Generals.
When these soldiers hit the beaches on D-Day, Canada was fighting with 5 divisions and 2 armored brigades of good, tough troops. Canadian historian Jack Ranestein says, when we entered the war in 1939, we had nothing and fewer than 500 officers to command.
Half of them weren't fit for military operations. They were either too old or in some cases lacking arms and legs. They were brave.
Colonel Harris Miller was in Halifax, 18 years old, and a corporal in the reserve when the war broke out. Months later, he was a captain in charge of training 150 men at a time, from St. John's to Halifax to Petawawa.
We learned about 20 Bofors anti-aircraft guns from books, and we did our gun drill on guns that were made out of 2x4.
The historian and the soldier agree that it takes years to prepare for war, and that includes training leaders, generals.
Ranestein says there were a number of Canadian soldiers who distinguished themselves as heroes on the battlefield and are still being honored today. But in this close inspection of the senior officer corps of the Second World War, called the Generals, Ranestein says while many were competent, only one Canadian general could truly be called a hero.
His name was Bert Hoffmeister, and like Miller, he too came out of the reserve and was considered by the regular officers to be an amateur.
He won 3 Distinguished Service Orders during the war. The joke in the Army was that his Batman should have got the Victoria Cross just for following him around, and it may even be true. In other words, he was a commanding officer as a battalion commander, brigade commander, division commander, who exposed himself to fire, who led by example.
Hoffmeister led his troops through Italy and Northern Europe. By that time, Miller had taken a demotion to lieutenant to see action, but was promptly promoted again to captain. Now the soldier and the historian warn Canada is in danger of repeating its historical mistake.
And I think we'd go through the same growing pains to a large extent that we did in 1939. At that time, we couldn't put uniforms on the men, and I'm sure if we were mobilized again, we couldn't put uniforms on them again.
In 1941 and 1942, Canadians died in action because they weren't properly trained, because they weren't properly led, because they weren't properly equipped.
In Halifax, Rick Grant, ATV News.